Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
Hi, I'm Susan, and I'm a college counselor and have read applications for a small liberal arts college and 2 research universities. My twins are recent college graduates.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of 2 daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy has a bachelor's degree from the University of Georgia and a master's degree from North Carolina State University. She works in private practice in Raleigh as a mental health therapist. And I'm so blessed to be able to work alongside both my beautiful daughters. School Match for You, a college counseling firm that I founded in 2010. This week in the news, Susan and I look at 3 articles on the growth of early applications. This is actually part 2 of the segment we started last week. And a mom from Nevada asked an excellent question about how everything seems like it's changing for my 2 native students when it comes to affirmative action. Can you help us understand the new landscape? Julia will be with me to answer that question. We have a brand new interview Julia and I did with Michael Keaton on changes with the new FAFSA. And Sylvia's back. It's been a half a year or so, and she'll be joined with Lisa for our brand new college spotlight. And they'll be looking at Wentworth Institute of Technology in Boston. Friends, if you missed the first part, Susan and I just talked about a wide range of topics related to the college admission process and application file reading. But in part 2, we really get into 3 different articles. One that appeared in Inside Higher Ed, another that appeared in the Brown Daily Herald, and another that appeared in Cornell's newspaper. All related to early applications and early decision. Hope you enjoy our conversation. So that is a segue to really going to touch base on 3 different articles. 2 are directly from college newspapers, and one is from Inside Higher Ed. So Inside Higher Ed has an article called Early Application Data Are Rosy If Complex. And it starts out by it's full of a lot of statistics, actually, and most of it is based on Common App releasing their numbers, where they follow trends. But I'll just read some of the stats in the article, and we'll kind of juxtapose this to an article that recently ran in Cornell's newspaper and in Brown's newspaper. So when you look at early applications submitted before November 1st for the Common App, a jump of 41% compared to the 2019-2020 cycle. And how does that break down? Well, when you look at it by demographics, it's actually interesting. So there's overall increase of 12% year over year in the Common App, but amongst underrepresented racial and ethnic groups, an increase of 21%. Upon applications from low-income zip codes, 52% increase, which is 20 points higher than from wealthy zip codes, where there's a 32% increase. And so a lot of people wonder, well, what's going on here? Well, Mark Freeman, Common App's Vice President, Data Analytics, he partly credits this surge to an increase in the platform's, the growth of their institutional members they've had. I mean, Susan, just the other day, I said, Common App's got more than 1,000 members now. And I looked, it's like 1,075 or something. Like, whoa, how do we get there that quickly? And the article goes on to say, we've been adding a lot more members to the platform from larger flagships and a lot of HBCUs and MSIs, which is back to one of our old admissions vernaculars for minority serving institutions. It quotes Robert Massa, one of the giants in the professions, VP Emeritus from enrollment at Dickinson College. He said he's struck by the size of the applicant surge, but he cautioned it may be reflecting a growth in the popularity of early action. he says we probably won't see the same numbers at the end of the cycle. The article goes on to say applications increased more at public than private. They're up 82% in public, 47% in private, going back to 2019. And here's another big number. I almost threw this one out. The Common App has added 28 large state flagships in the past decade. I know when I first moved to Atlanta, Susan, the South most of the Southern flagships were not the Common App.
That's right.
But now look, the Georgias and the Floridas and the Tennessees, I mean, they're all there.
Texas.
Yes, Texas recently. So yeah, these are big ones.
And even up here with in the Northeast with Rutgers, that was an enormous addition.
Yeah, because for so long they were a coalition, exclusive. Maryland for a long time was that too.
Maryland just went Common App.
Yep.
Washington State.
Yep. So Mass has cited another reason for the gap between public and private application. Price matters, he said, and as students are increasingly skeptical of higher ed or opting not to go, more are focusing on cheaper public's options at first. But he said some of the major differences he expected to see after the Supreme Court decision against affirmative action, like higher rates of self-reported demographics, never materialized. And then this is probably one of the key points we want to talk about, because this goes on to what the other articles talk about, that applicants are applying even earlier. So here's a quote. The number of students choosing to apply via early admission has leaped in recent years, and the number of institutions offering an early action option has increased substantially. That could account for some of the growth in the applications submitted by November 1st. Freeman said that early action is far and away the fastest growing application option on the Common App. The number of early action and early decision applications combined is nearly equal now to the number for regular decision. That was unheard of when you and I worked together.
That's
Susan.
Shocking. It really is shocking. Yeah.
Shocking. Applications for the first rounds of EA and ED increased by 38% since 2019. Second round applications grew by 90%, according to unpublished data by the Common App. And then here's one of my favorite quotes from the article. Internally, we talk about early action as the new regular decision.
Yeah.
It goes on to say that as the barriers to entry keep falling, it's only natural outcome that more students are applying to more institutions. It says this fall, growth at highly selective echelon has actually leveled off. And the most significant increases have been at institutions with acceptance rate of 50% or higher. So, there's some more information in this article, but I want to do a quick summary of these three and then get your thoughts. So now we're going to fast forward to a November 30th article that appeared in the Cornell Daily Sun that several of you sent to us. And it's entitled, Cornell Reduces Proportion of Students Admitted Through Early Decision Track. So we always hear early is getting bigger. Well, the faculty senate at Cornell is pushing back. And that, Cornell's has been a place where that faculty has had a lot of say in the admission process. In an effort to increase equity in the admission process, the faculty senate discussed the implications of fewer students being admitted in the early decision round moving forward at their October 11th meeting. And it also shows some stats. It shows how Cornell admitted 1,670 students in the class of 2027 during the early decision application round, out of 4,994 that were accepted. So 33% of the students that got admitted came through the early round. But it gives the data. You had a 17.6% chance of getting admitted or ED compared to 5.7% in regular decision. And then it says the university's presidential task force on undergraduate admissions is providing recommendations in September for how Cornell could alter and improve their admission process. The university is obligated to regularly review its process to ensure the application process effectively recruits and admits a diverse group of talented students from across the world. So now we have Cornell taking that position. And then the last article I want to read is from, I think it's the Brown, is it the Brown Herald? Sounds
yes.
Like, I think, yeah, Brown Herald. Yep. It's right from the Brown Herald, which is their school newspaper. And this one is entitled, Early Decision Applications Face Uncertain Future. It says Brown and other schools are reconsidering early decision admission policies. And so I'll read from this. This is by Owen Dalkamp and Juliana Chang, November 2nd, 2023. Since 2001, Brown applicants have had the option to apply ED, binding admission practice. But on Wednesday, the latest cohort of hopeful students submitted their binding applications. But this policy's future is currently under deliberation at the university. In September, President Christina Paxson convened an ad hoc committee on admissions policies to examine, among other policies, whether or not there's something that is better suited to our mission than early decision. Provost Francis Doyle told the Herald at the time, in the wake of the Supreme Court's decision to limit race-conscious college admissions, many higher ed institutions have strived to find alternatives to sustain diverse student bodies. And it goes on to say that it looks at the data here as well and how ED has grown over the years, looks at the class of 2027, and 879 of the admitted students came in through ED, versus if you go back 4 years later, it was 769. And I know someone might think, what's the difference? 769, 879. But when you look at it in terms of percentages, that's actually a pretty big percentage increase. At Brown, the policy was implemented initially to reduce the workload of admission officers overburdened by high numbers of early applications. And it goes on to look at the demographic data of who is it that's getting in early. And for one, 13% acceptance rate in ED for last year's class and a 3.8% acceptance rate. Just brutal, Susan. That's less than, we're getting to less than 1 in 25 right now.
I know.
In regular. And I found Brown was just absolutely brutal last year.
Yep.
Yeah. And then they did a poll. So I'll read this. In a fall poll of first-year students, the Herald found demographic differences between respondents who applied early and those who did not. And boy, do I ever agree with this, Susan, because, I've worked with all sides of the financial spectrum. And I think this was completely on point. So it says, early applicants were more likely to receive no financial aid, hold legacy status, have higher levels of parental education, have attended private high schools, be recruited athletes.
Yep.
Non-first-gen respondents were also 2 times more likely to apply early compared to first-gen students. Applicants with access to college counselors also apply early at higher rates, as they are explicitly advised to take advantage of applying early, according to Kallenberg wrote. Many early decision applicants hail from well-resourced families and well-resourced schools. So it's interesting. Early decision under examination at a number of schools. And, we should have mentioned this on the podcast, but earlier this year, Virginia Tech dropped early decision.
That's right.
And they explicitly said they're concerned about the equity of early decision. So, Susan, take this where you want to go. You can talk about anything. Just wonder what your thoughts are.
Well, you did a great synopsis, Mark. And there's this Common App research brief that came out on the 15th of November. Was very comprehensive, tons of data, tons of graphs. I think it's pretty much in the public domain for any counselors or parents who really want to look at a lot of this data. And there are a couple things that strike me. One is that, so what would it look like if all let's just pick on the Ivy League, the ones that are ED now, like Brown and Cornell, went to single choice early action. I can't imagine some colleges doing this independently. We've always had some that are single choice early action and some that are ED, and a few have flip-flopped a couple times over the last decade. But, they're not going to give it up wholesale unless they all give it up. Right. I can't imagine that Brown would give away its position in the hierarchy of highly rejective colleges.
And if people wonder, what are we talking about? One need to only look at Boston College. So Boston College had the same admissions policy that Georgetown and Notre Dame had
That's
till
right.
3-4 years ago, right? Restrictive. They had a restrictive early action. You could apply EA to other schools, but you could not apply ED somewhere else. They got rid of that and jumped right to ED1, ED2. And Susan and I were just having a conversation a couple of weeks ago about how hard Boston College was to get in regular last year. It was really tough. I mean, for those of us that's been doing this for a while, we have to completely recalibrate our expectations for these schools when things like that happen. And so there's no doubt in my mind, and I'm sure Susan would agree, Boston College has no regret that they made that decision, right?
Absolutely.
Like their average SATs have gone from 1395 to 1520. Now we know a lot of that is because the bottom half's not submitting. But you combine that with predicting yield is just so important when you're in admissions. And it's not easy. That's why these schools pay the big bucks to these data quants, and they still oftentimes get it wrong.
That's right.
And so much depends on it. And I think sometimes people think it's all about just improving your stats. And certainly that's not lost on them. But I also like to communicate it from the standpoint of, one, it's not always easy even to get the right number of heads in beds and not over-enroll and under-enroll. But the other thing is just you have so many stakeholders that are watching those numbers like a hawk. And they're not impressed that your school is full if you're halfway selective. They're going to say, well, how do we know? They're going to go to other metrics of quality, whatever they deem that to be. And that's going to be a little different for every school. Like for some people, it might be test scores. For some, it might be GPA. For some, it may be different compositional diversity goals, like, or major goals. There's going to be very different school by school. But, whoever you report to in admissions is watching those numbers. And it's just a lot easier for you to have success at having a balanced class if you can lock certain people in.
Well, yeah. And Cornell has a tough job because Cornell has a College of Agriculture.
I know, so confusing.
And they've got statutory colleges that are partially funded by the state of New York.
Yeah.
And they are obligated to favor New York State applicants for those colleges. Those may be students who are less likely to be in an ED pool. They're juggling some competing priorities at Cornell that are, I think, a little bit different, even from Brown's. Cornell has always been,
plus it's bigger.
Yeah, much bigger, hugely international. A harder sell for American students of color because of its location. There are just all sorts of things at Cornell that the other Ivies don't have to deal with as explicitly as they do. And I think when Cornell's hitting 50% early decision, I'd love to know the demographic breakdown of that ED group, because I think it could very well be lacking a lot of the diversity that Cornell is working very hard to attract. This might not be true of, say, Columbia or Harvard. I don't even know. They're kind of each is its own place. But
Penn,
Cornell has to recruit in a way for a very different kind of business major. They've got the hotel school, they've got the applied economics and management program. That's not really a traditional business school. It's not really competing with Wharton School of Business. It's its own special breed of cat. And it's a very complicated admissions picture. And I can see why for them filling over half the class early decision, that group is probably much more homogeneous than they would like their entire first year class to be. I mean, that's me reading into it, Mark. What do you think?
No, but I would agree 100%. And, the interesting thing about these conversations is they pit different priorities that schools have against each other, right? So you have all your diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice initiatives, and your attempt to try to broaden the pool of who's in the class. But then you also have your legacy and your athletes and your ability to lock people in, all things that tend to cater to wealthier clientele. And they're like in tension with each other. And for most schools, and I'm talking about only 181 colleges and universities have early decision. So the overwhelming majority of schools don't have ED, right? We're not talking, especially in the public school realm. And when we're talking moderately to highly selective, ED is a very big part of their enrollment management. And it's interesting because they know that the pool is wealthier and more private school and more counselors and more legacy, and they know that. But yet they first of all, they need those families and they value those families. We always don't want to talk in a way to diminish those families.
Of course.
Those are important families. Right? We're only talking in the context of not wanting your whole school to be that way. So how they go about navigating that, knowing that there's such a bias isn't a strong word. There's such a preference or predilection, maybe is a better word, for that ED pool to be privileged. And it makes sense because, like when I first came to KIPP, Susan, nobody was applying ED.
Right.
The concept of it was anathema. That was one of the things I worked at changing because I tried to help them to understand that there are schools that your chances of getting in not only going to be significantly better, but there's schools with deep pockets and your chance of getting a better aid offer occurs if you apply. It's so foreign to the concept of I'm not committing without knowing the price.
Exactly.
That just makes no sense, And so that concept, and then also a lot of times in other circles, just the timeline doesn't work because people are starting later. Like they're just, to get all this stuff done in time, it just doesn't work if you're not getting counseling and guidance. So, and if you're first gen or you're in a under-resourced school or you have a school counselor with a caseload of 450, that's
right.
That may or may not have much college training, and at a minimum, they don't have a lot of time for you when they're juggling 450 kids. So, one of the articles talked about how much of a disadvantage the first gen under-resourced students are at because they're not really in the pool, other than a lot of CBOs have really come in lately and done a lot of real great work. Obviously, programs like Posse and Questbridge are ED programs.
That's right.
They've realized that. But how schools navigate the tension between these things is interesting. I completely agree with you, though. It would be a bold move for Brown to walk away from ED. I mean, they could pull it off, but would they do it without any restrictions? Be surprising. They'd be the only Ivy League school to do it.
That's right.
I did a week of training at Harvard, and I was told from a very high-level person that William Fitzsimmons has been there 50 years.
I know. Gosh.
Wants to implement unrestricted early action like MIT has. But there's certain people that know that when Harvard once had that, they didn't have the same yield. And so even a giant like him in the profession, and even a biggest brand name of the brand names, they're still yield conscious. And look at Princeton in 2021. Remember how they went away from unrestricted or from single choice for 1 year?
That's right.
If it worked as well as they liked, they could have just stuck with it. They went right back to it. So when the biggest brand names of the brand names feel they need to have some sense that we're at least leading going in, or we have good reason to believe we're the first choice, then we'll do that. I don't know about you, Susan. I hate single choice early action. I absolutely hate it. Because, what's happened over time is that some of these other early action schools now have differential admit rates between EA. So you're blowing yourself out of pools like Chicago and Tulane and Richmond. It's so much harder, and many others that have EA and ED. And then to do all that for a low admit rate. But Brown has always been a little unconventional. We used to call it the humanitarian Ivy.
That's right. That's right.
And I can't say I'd be shocked if somebody, I remember, Susan and I, we used to debate before COVID, what would be the first Ivy League school to go test optional? Remember we used to have that conversation?
That's right. We sure did.
We sure did. And Brown was always one of the ones that was kind of in there.
Although I had my money on Cornell because of who was leading the admissions office.
Yes.
Had come from another institution that had been one of the first research universities to go test optional. So I thought the chances might be there, but I think you're right.
Yeah. Yeah. So what I think is interesting is that Brown and Cornell are very public about this. This isn't some secret memo that leaked out. They want it known. Cornell wants it known. No, we're reducing our EDs, and Brown's made it very public. We're doing a study, and normally when you do something like that, you don't come back and say nothing's status quo, nothing's changing. I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, but I'm expecting, I don't know if I want to call it seismic, that's too strong of a word, but I'm expecting a bold announcement from Brown when they finish their study. I think at a minimum, they'll do what Cornell is, we're going to reduce our numbers. Because that's kind of the UVA thing, right? So, when I interviewed Greg Roberts on the podcast, it was right at the time when UVA went to ED. And at that time, they were the only flagship in the country.
That's right.
That had it. And man, did he have arrows coming at his head. I mean, the Washington Post ran a big cover article, critical. And one of the things that Greg said, and he made it very, very clear, even talked about it on our podcast, they were not going to be putting an extra thumb on the scale they were not going to take an applicant in ED they weren't taking in regular.
That's right.
So they were going to use it to help manage their caseload. And I know it's a fascinating thing. I don't know if you heard the interview recently with Rick Clark and Brennan, where Brennan is in favor of getting rid of ED, and Rick said no. I think institutions need to be allowed to operate the way they do.
That's right.
It's a fascinating conversation. Any thoughts on where you see this going?
Well, I think what all colleges experience as their ED, the percentage of the students that they fill ED, and as soon as colleges went above a third of the first year class being filled through ED, they started seeing incredible inflation in the competition in the regular pool.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody kind of lived with that for the decade leading up to COVID,
mm-hmm.
where they were all secretly enjoying, well, maybe not secretly, but enjoying the enrollment management, the control over the numbers, bringing in the class on target. The shame of going to your waiting list kind of disappeared entirely as colleges realized how much better it was to come in a little bit below your target size and then fill from the waiting list. Because first of all, they were great kids waiting on the waiting list.
Sure.
But also the ED and the wait list are the only times when a college yields 1-for-1. Right? It's kind of the ultimate bookends of enrollment management. But the inflation of competition, in the last years, and of course this got worse as the numbers jumped with COVID. But
something, Susan, and I never really understood this till Chris Gruber said this. He talked about the great financial crisis, 07 to 09. Many of us were just scared of what does that look like for our pop. So we had a noticeable increase then, and most of us never really went back. I think obviously ED's been growing for a while, back,
right.
But there was something I think there's something to be said for that. There was a lot of concern with people seeing stock portfolios dropping 50-60%. What is that going to mean for 529s? And boy, we better lock people in. And then there is an aspect, the more you lock in, it can make your job easier. It leads to these class divisions. And it obviously makes the admit rate so much harder in regular. For those who aren't following, if a school takes 1,000 kids in their class and they bring 50% in ED, so now there's only 500 spots, and the masses are going to apply in regular for all the reasons we've discussed, that's what drives your admit rate down.
That's right.
And then let's face it, that's kind of what gets celebrated everywhere, right? Then you see your rankings go up and your bond ratings can go up, and then you can actually yield a higher kid now because, you're the hot, there's this whole site perverse in a lot of ways where
it is.
The incentives are to get crazier and crazier and crazier. And some of the schools that have really done it on steroids have been rewarded in a lot of ways. Even if people have criticized them, they're the ones that get celebrated and everybody tries to mimic. And I don't know how we get off the treadmill.
That's the question. That's where we're poised right now, is trying to figure out, and there were a few things in the Common App research brief that I think pointed to some of this, this uncertainty, that the applications to public universities are growing much more than to private universities right now this year, with this, especially with this ED group.
See, here's the only thing that the challenge that I had. I'm a stat nerd, so I loved all the stats that came out of it. But
Sure.
the one of the problems I had was when you've increased your public flagships,
Yes, of course.
and 28 flagships in the last decade, and you've increased your HBCUs and MSIs by 77%, it throws off all the aggregate data. Like, I don't know
Right.
how much is the growth is occurred because you have way more schools now. And
Right.
flagships always generate a lot of applications. The Marylands, the Texases,
Oh, yeah.
the Georgias, the Floridas, the Rutgers. I mean, these are big, big operations. So it was hard for me to suss out, they're giving
Right.
raw numbers, but you also have, more people in the club. It would be like saying, some colleges, some high schools like to tout the total amount of aggregate scholarship money that their class.
Oh, I know.
I know we don't like that. We don't like, Susan, you never did that. You would never stand for that.
So disingenuous.
I hate it too. But it would be like a school saying, "Oh, our kids got $7 million in financial aid." And you had 100 kids in the class, and then you grew your class to 150 or 170, and then you come back and you say, "We got $11 million." So it was a little tricky for me to
no, you're right.
To understand how much of that raw number stuff just boiled down to the fact that they've added a lot of big popular schools.
Well, do you think that's also the reason for the other data point that stymied me, which is that the growth was greatest with the group of institutions with admit rates between 50% and 74%. So much less selective.
I think it's because, and you've seen this over the years, Susan, most of the more selective schools have been on the Common App for a while.
Mm-hmm.
The private schools, they're not new to the Common App. A lot of the newer, and you've seen this. Remember when the Common App used to require you to be more holistic?
Oh, completely. Yeah,
and
that only changed a couple of years ago.
Yeah, now they're accepting schools that admit by the numbers. They're accepting schools that don't even require the personal statement.
No, no more essay requirement.
Right. So the growth has happened in schools that admit more kids than they deny. So then it shouldn't be surprising. And I think that also explains some of the numbers you saw with students of color. Like, now they've had an initiative to recruit more MSIs and HBCUs. That's been an initiative. And I think that explains it. I don't see increased numbers of students of color applying ED more so than majority students. I don't see that. So I think that's just the recruitment side. I think so there's interesting data, but the whole thing, you can make stats, mean anything. You have to be careful of their interpretation.
Oh, well, and truthfully, what all of us who read applications are waiting to see is, once this cycle is over, what has happened to the students of color. This data in the Common App research brief points to larger, significant growth with the URM population, the underrepresented minority population, perhaps in reaction to the end of affirmative action in terms of college admissions. What I'm finding as a reader, and this may be a topic for another choice, and I think a lot of readers would agree, is that students are as open and in their narratives as they ever were. I think that hasn't changed, and that was always the first prompt on the college app, which is what story is central to your identity that we need to know to fully understand who you are. And
I don't think you're going to see the statistical drop that the UC saw when they got rid of affirmative action in 1996, and a place like Berkeley just drastically saw like the Black kids decrease. I don't think you're going to see that because so many of these other schools, they're already reading holistically.
Yes.
And they can still do a lot of contextual reads. They'll use landscape more and the school you're coming from, and you're going to see the complete continuum, because I'm seeing the complete continuum in the language coming out of schools that they're using. I mean, I look at like where Emory is, not basically the statement out of Emory was, one of the reps, I'm a lawyer, and that decision said that we can't admit kids because of their race or ethnicity, and we already were not doing that.
Exactly.
We were doing contextual read before anyway,
Exactly.
and we've been given permission to take that in, give it in. Then you have that middle position. I guess you would say someone like Dartmouth. I need conversation of how your experience has impacted you. If that's not in there in a significant way. And then you have the Clemson. We're not even talking about it anymore. We're not even talking in committee. Like, we don't want to get sued. We don't, there are some schools that are afraid of lawsuits. Some of those conversations are happening. And I think some of the biggest brands know they have a target on them.
Absolutely.
So, fortunately, they never put restrictions on recruitment. I mean, Yale, remember that lawsuit got dropped against Yale, and Yale's beefed up their recruitment, beefed up a number of unique programs that they're providing. My suspicions, Susan, is that you're not going to see significant drops in numbers. Now, the question is, will it even get reported? Because it used to be reported in the context of, look how diverse we are. And now I think some people may be afraid to say, look, right, you're still using it.
Meaning in their profiles.
Yeah, or in their, when they do their press releases and all of that stuff. Like, one thing I'm noticing with testing, when I search school, I always like to look up the school profile, because Common Data Set's great, but it's a year old, right? Where if you get the schools, you can get current year. And if it's a year like Duke had this year, Duke's up 28% in ED apps. So I always want current data.
Absolutely.
I'm seeing more and more of those schools not putting their standardized testing into their profiles when they report out the class. And I think it kind of makes sense, because, they're always being held on the carpet. Like, you tell me test optional, but then just, why is it count for scholarship? Like, people are constantly being, held accountable. Prove to me, I don't know if I believe you, right? So that's one reason some schools have even gone test free, score free, test blind, like, just forget it all. Right. Like, we're going to, and then others have dropped it from their scholarship assessments, and then others have dropped it completely from how they report out their numbers. Of course, that doesn't mean it's never a factor.
Right. Right. Well, and, reading, and maybe we can talk about the landscape at another time, because I think that would be interesting for families to know a little bit more about why some colleges that, when they talk about the potential value that scores can add to an application, it's because they are using the landscape, and they are looking at scores very differently from the way that they used to look at scores. Mm-hmm. And I'm experiencing that. Readers everywhere are experiencing that. Some schools have been using the landscape now for 6 or 7 years.
Are you referring, Susan, to like some schools? Now, this is what MIT would say. Some people, like, Bruce Pock used to say this, Pomona. When we see a real high tester from an underserved school, we flag that as somebody who's, are you talking about that component of it or not?
Well, the landscape lets an application reader see the student's scores in a kind of a graph of all the scores earned by students in that school. Now, it's all the students who took the test and are in that data set. So a student might be in the top 25% of test takers in their high school, really a top test taker for that high school. And that score could well be below the median of that college. But that score still has a lot of status. It carries a lot of weight, because it's talking about the population in which the student lives and learns.
The problem I have with, I'm all about a deep contextual read, and I love it. But so when I got to KIPP, one thing I noticed right away, and for people that don't know, KIPP, the Knowledge to Power program, is designed to target first-gen, under-resourced zip codes. But as a charter school, unlike a school like Crystal Ray's, we couldn't impose an income cap, because it was lottery. So when I looked at, like, who were the kids that I worked with, whether it was boarding school, the kids that would go to the Exeters and the Andovers and the Hotchkisses, or the kids that were going to the Princetons and all that, their parents were educated.
Right. Well, that's what ups the scores. That's the correlation.
Yeah, but they were, they would, sometimes kids get the benefit of being in a school population that is much more underrepresented. But the parents, if you actually look at the parents, there were not. And I think that flies under the radar only in the most comprehensive of contextual reads. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I don't know how much Landscape captures that, or at least I guess it would boil down to the individual assessment of the individual reader. Do you have any thoughts on that? Because it was like night or day. Like if I was to tell you the demographics of the highest performing kids and their parent education, parent income versus those in the middle, the correlation was unbelievable. They were kids with educated parents and six-figure, sometimes 200,000 plus incomes. And those were the ones that were getting in all those places. Just because of how it makes sense. You can give your kid 18 years of advantages in every single way. But sometimes those kids benefited because people would come in, oh, this first gen under-resourced school. And oh, wow, goodness, look at this superstar. Yeah. When you look at their parents, it explains everything. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's why scores in isolation are not just meaningless. They are they are damaging. They are misleading. And hopefully we're entering an era now of where scores are looked at very differently. And if colleges are going to use them at all, that they come to a much deeper understanding of how to use them. And when they're saying what they are saying, what they are representing. And, do I hope they go away? Of course I do. I think the damage that they wreak way outweighs any tiny little vestige of value that they could possibly contribute. And, I listened very carefully to your recent podcast, Mark, on, when are test scores, what am I trying to say? What was the title of that podcast? It was, when are colleges really test optional? And I think we need to hold colleges accountable for their use of scores and very specifically what they are learning, what they believe they are learning, measuring, able to predict. What is the validity of scores within their university community? And, anybody can prove validity of an SAT, a standalone SAT. That does not mean that they are coming up with the very highest prediction of success. And there's close to 50 years of research out there now on certain colleges where
including one you worked at.
Yeah. I mean, and the work that Bill Hiss went on to do after Bates, working with institutions that were much larger and much more diverse than a few small liberal arts colleges, in New England. But it's our scores really allowing a college to make the best possible admissions decisions. And what is the basis for that? And that's where I think there's been a real lack of accountability.
I mean, it's such a complex question because I would not go so far as to say scores have no value. I don't know if even you would say that as strong as you believe, in the test-free, test optional movement. But my challenge is always, can the bias that they introduce be put in proper perspective? I have this saying, numbers do voodoo on the brain. And I see it in other things too. I follow athletic recruiting. And once you get labeled a 2-star or versus a 4-star, everything is almost seen through the prism. What do you expect? He was a 2-star. Like numbers do have this weird effect of causing you to overlook character. And I think even really, really seasoned readers. So that's always my concern. And my concern is, can scores be put in context? Like we talk a lot, but can it actually be like, we talk about it, but does it actually work? Or does it introduce such a bias so that whatever the value that you get is outweighed by the detriment?
I totally appreciate what you're saying. And I think that's one thing that the College Board Landscape tool is reaching for, is providing a real sociological context for understanding an individual student's scores. And moving away from those presumptions about the prediction of college GPA. I mean, the SAT was designed to predict first-year GPA, nothing more. not ongoing GPA, success, retention, graduation, none of that. It was all about first year grade point average. And that is not far-fetched. But there are other things, either in combination with the SAT. This is what multivariable regression analysis is all about, is coming up with the right combination of factors, of quantified and qualitative factors that have the best prediction value.
Well, the founder of Princeton Review agrees with everything you said. I've heard him articulate, this, and because what he looks at is he looks at the percentage correlation of test scores of GPA of high school GPA and courses, and then when you layer on test scores, it only went up like 2/100ths.
Yes,
in terms of adding the accuracy. So you also have to look at that, right? Anyway,
it adds the value. It adds is minuscule, and the damage it does is enormous. And that's what I think colleges have to own up to.
Well, and especially if you can really train your readers how to read the right way. I mean, I think the mastery of that 20-year Bates study really was an attestation to Bates training their readers how to read a file well. The fact that you could go out and could find students that could basically graduate with similar graduation rates, similar GPAs, attrition, all that, very, very similar, statistically insignificant over a 20-year study. That shows what can be done with proper training on how to read and identify whether it's the personal qualities that the student has or whether it's the contextual family background factors. But yeah, I think one of the lazy things to do is scores can be a lazy way to do admissions. Yeah.
I feel the same way about class rank, but that's a topic for another conversation.
Well, Susan, I let this go really long just because I think our listeners will love this content. And, this reminds me of the conversations that we used to have at West Town.
I know.
I remember your husband would come in, Susan, let's get in here and eat.
That's
right.
And
be in your office talking. They're about to close down the dining room.
And we'd miss dinner.
Yeah, we'd be doing this. So I said, let's just have one of those and push the record button.
It's a real treat, Mark. Always.
I love it every month when we get to talk. Thanks, Susan, for all your efforts. Yeah. Have a good one.
You too.
And now it's time for a question from one of our listeners.
All right, Julia, we have a question about affirmative action from a mom who has a few students who are Native. And of course, I'm going to come to you for anybody Native just because of your work in that community for about 15 years now. We'll play the question and I'd love your response.
Hi, Mark. I'm a listener from Nevada and I have 2 children, one who is a current freshman in college and a current sophomore in high school. And I don't know if this question will apply to many people, but now after the affirmative action decision, my children are both Native students, and I'm really confused as to what this is going to mean for my high school sophomore compared to what we went through with the admissions process for my current college freshman. I feel like this may be a whole new process that we are relearning. Do you have any insight with that, or is it something we're going to have to just keep an eye on? I guess I'm lucky that I have a sophomore and not a junior or senior this year. Thank you so much for taking my question and for all that you and your team do. Bye.
So this was a great question, and I'm so excited that you have Indigenous students who are college bound. Really exciting.
Somebody is smiling so much over here. I feel like her face is going to break.
Yeah. and thank you again for College Horizons for just like, there's just so many wonderful students I wouldn't have met without College Horizons.
Julia, why don't you say a little bit in case people don't know College Horizons? They missed when you did that episode. And so you can, just a blurb on your background there.
Sure. I feel like I should get a tattoo because I love them so much. And I'd be happy to. And I am not an Indigenous person. I'm not part of the community. College Horizons is one of the largest college access programs for Native and Indigenous youth in the United States. And it was started in the late 90s, I believe, and currently has about a 95% acceptance rate for its students that are accepted into the program. They spend a week plus, usually around 10 days. It's almost camp style, and they learn all about applying to college and going to college. And a lot of the partner schools with College Horizons are schools from all over the United States that are there because they would like to support these students and also potentially have a larger Indigenous population on their campuses. Or if you're like Haverford, we didn't really yield a lot of them, but it felt like it was the right thing to do. We have a wealth of information and it's easy to give that to other people. So,
and haven't you been working with them since 2009?
Yes, 2009.
Do you realize that means this is your third decade?
I know. I did take a break a little bit during my non-admission officer time, but it has been in the program. Also a shout out to any listeners that we might have who are in college. College Horizons also has a Graduate Horizons program. So that's for Indigenous students looking to go to graduate school. And then there's also a scholar program for students in between after they graduate from high school and before they go to college. Shout out to Lawrence University that has often hosted this program, but it's sort of like a, not really a bridge program, but a way for students to kind of understand what college might be like. A lot of the students who go to College Horizons do not come from schools like Milton Academy. They go to maybe large public schools or schools on the reservation where there's not a large 4-year going college population. So it's a really amazing program run by the most amazing people with the most amazing students.
All right, Julia, we got to get to the question. If I get you on College Horizons, I'll never get you off.
So I was there this summer at Emory. And so that was right after the Supreme Court decision had come out about no longer being using race conscious admissions or affirmative action for race in the college process. So Indigenous and Native is different than some other underrepresented racial categories. So that's important for us to know here. Essentially, my takeaway and our understanding, and so far what I've sort of seen in these early decision, early action rounds has come out is that colleges can still practice affirmative action with Indigenous students in the sense that they are talking about citizenship. They are not talking about a racial category. And I actually have seen this so far in my results in that I might have a student who is from South America, Central America, or the African continent. And because their citizenship is a different is a different country, but it's underrepresented, that a college is still practicing affirmative action for that student because they are allowed to by the letter of the law. And so I don't know, and that remains to be a little seen in terms of, I'll say this, most of the students I work with who are Indigenous are not necessarily in early action or early decision pools, or maybe at highly selective college pools. And so I don't have a sort of critical mass of data right now as to did those decisions go really differently than I've seen before. But my understanding is that for your sophomore child, it maybe shouldn't be all that different. I also think it's important to talk about actually, I just used the word critical mass, but the word critical mass when it comes to affirmative action in colleges is that a college also has to, before this recent decision, a college also has to show that, there's a reason to practice affirmative action for an underrepresented group. It can't just be like, oh my gosh, this is the only Indigenous or Native American student in our pool, so of course we're going to admit them. So the college should have a critical mass of those students, so that way it is supporting if they do admit that student, and also that you're not just admitting the student for the sole reason of their racial background or category. And this is especially true in Native American Indigenous populations, where they are underrepresented compared to other underrepresented minorities, such as Latinx students or Black or African American students. So I am hopeful that for this listener's sophomore or youngest student, that we shouldn't see colleges treating that any differently. But to be honest with you, that remains to be seen. I haven't seen any data yet to look at trends.
Yeah, and I don't have a lot of specifics to add with natives because in indigenous, because I just don't have a large population. I have one student this year, and some years I don't even have any. So I don't feel like I have a big sample size. I feel I can answer that from a racial standpoint. There's a whole bunch of different gradations of different positions I'm hearing along the spectrum of schools carve out. And it reminds me a lot of what we say with test optional, like be very, very mindful of the exact language that's used both on websites and how it's described. And when you do, you can completely see the different positions along the continuum. Everywhere from we absolutely cannot talk about it at all. We are banned and it's a non-starter. It doesn't come up in committee. We're not getting sued, to we got permission if the lived experience is discussed, and we weren't admitting people before anyway, just because I checked a box. We weren't doing that. And you have a lot of sort of positions on the way. I do think admission officers are at their core, schools at their core believe that colleges should not be an echo chamber.
Correct.
And best learning happens when different people of different perspectives are all brought together in the classroom, in the dining room, in the dorms. They strongly believe in that at their core. And I do think right now we're in a hypersensitive time where I don't want to get a lawsuit.
Yep.
But I think schools will still find creative ways to value diversity in the admission process. They just have to really go about it in a way now to stay in compliance. And I find it's funny, it's weird because so many schools weren't practicing affirmative action anyway. So that group is a complete non-factor.
Yep.
I find it's the most selective that are sort of really watching it because they also know they're targets for lawsuits too.
Exactly.
They're targets for lawsuits. So they're, I find, really treading lightly this, at least these first few years after the decision, because Ed Blum is on a mission to take anybody down that has to do with, he went after a venture capital fund that was funding African-American women in business because they have such a small percentage of the venture capital money out there. And he went after it and won a district, judge ruling that was not legal. Now it has to be appealed. So he's on the rampage and schools know he's out there and others like him. But that's all that I can say. I don't have specifics. What I will say is this, though. I don't see it drastically impacting who's admitted in a class. And I actually will predict that when the numbers come out, if we can get reliable numbers, because now it's a little trickier, but I don't think you're going to see massive changes in racial composition in student bodies. Do you have any thoughts on that, Julia?
I don't know. I'll say this. I've seen a difference
in conversations you're having with people.
Yep. And also our early action and ED results so far.
Yeah.
Either one or the other. Either a student that maybe applied to a very selective school that comes from an underrepresented racial background who I thought, not fully inappropriate, but I would be very surprised if the student got it, getting deferred. Almost, I'm wondering, is that college trying to see, I don't know who we're going to get and who we're going to admit. So we need to kind of keep everyone around until we can see that whole picture. Or I saw I had a real head scratcher this fall. And by the metrics, I would think that this school could easily defend. So should they get sued, and
Sure.
then like this student had a very high test scores and very strong curriculum and grades at my school. So I don't think someone could be able to say, hey, you took this student because they you were practicing affirmative action here. But I sort of wondered, like, if they're so scared, are they just deciding to kind of like, let's just not even bother, let's not even try. So I have seen a little bit of a difference. What I'm mostly afraid, to be fully honest with you, Mark, is more at the large public schools, right? So something that happened at the University of California system, for example.
Sure.
I really think, for example, the University of Massachusetts system is going to be like overwhelmingly white. I'm actually really worried about that. But I think you're right in that, and I hope you're right, that when it comes to, mostly selective or definitely holistic admissions, that we shouldn't see a huge difference. But even now when I'm talking to colleges, sometimes they all have different interpretations of the law.
They really
so some
do.
of them are saying not even about, can I link, adversity to your underrepresented racial background, but some are saying like, you need to show that you've like brought others out of adversity through an affinity, they're sort of, they each have their own lawyers that have said this is what we're comfortable with. And so,
and others don't define it through adversity. Others feel strongly about not defining it through adversity at all. You could talk about experiences. I had an admission officer tell me, if a student talked about their active involvement in Jack and Jill is an upskill, upperly mobile, social group that many African Americans are involved in, so they can be exposed to positive role models for their kids. That could be something. They use Jack and Jill as an example. So not everybody defines it through adversity. So it's very complex.
Yes.
I would definitely agree with you. I would look for the biggest changes to happen in the public schools.
Yeah.
They don't have as many admission officers per student. They already weren't doing holistic admissions with taking as many variables into consideration to begin with.
Right.
And so that's where I think you'll see some changes, and we're just gonna have to see over time. But I do know this, that schools at their core do believe that assembling different perspectives is the best way to educate people, and I don't see them giving that fight up easily, especially at at schools that really practice like more I hate to use that term holistic admissions because it's so overblown, and everybody uses it, but
everyone,
comprehensive whole person admission. Yeah. I gotta come up with a better term, Julia.
Yeah. It's not your fault. They're changing it on you.
I know, but even before the affirmative action thing, it's like, it's kind of like everybody wants to say they use holistic admissions because the opposite is, I judge you by your numbers. Right, nobody wants to say that. Yeah. So then schools will say we practice holistic admissions, and in effect, it's a lot of them just are reverting back to metrics.
Right.
So anyway, I hope that's helpful. We love to get listeners from places like Nevada because we don't get that many questions there. Yeah. So if you're out there in one of these states that we don't hear from that often, send your question in and we'll make sure we take it on the air. Thanks, Julia.
Thank you.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, in part one of my interview with Michael Keaton, the VP of Enrollment at Ursinus College, Michael shares his bio. Then Michael shares some of the changes to the new FAFSA. Michael shares how the changes to the FAFSA are impacting students and college admission offices. Michael talks about some of the kinks in the FAFSA rollout, and he talks about the wrinkles that are impacting schools very differently. And then Michael talks about how the new FAFSA is impacting multiple kids in college at the same time and how colleges are addressing this. And we recorded this 6 days ago, and some changes have occurred even since then. So I'll have an addendum at the end. This is actually a one-part interview with Michael. He's back, but we're moving on to a different topic in the next episode. Listen and enjoy. Friends, you're in for a real treat today. We're here with one of the giants of the profession, someone Julie and I have known for quite a while, getting close to 20 years. Michael Keaton. Hi, Michael.
Hello there. Great to be here with you, friends. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, this has been in the works. How long, Julia, have we been working on Michael?
Yeah, a little. I mean, maybe since I started on the pod, he was my first person I thought of when you made the kind offer of who might I like to hear on here.
Yeah, great. So, Michael, for those of our listeners who don't know who you are, why don't you walk us back, take us through your educational journey, various stints you had, and walk us right up to where you are now. We love having thought leaders that have been at multiple institutions. We think it just gives you a really unique perspective. So share your background with us.
Sure, happy to do so. So when I talk about my educational career journey, it goes back to my undergrad days. Grew up in suburban Philadelphia, went to Upper Dublin High School, and from Upper Dublin High School, go Flying Cardinals, to Syracuse University, where I studied speech communication. Now they call it communication and rhetorical studies, but it was speech communication during my day. And I didn't know what I wanted to do when I stepped foot on campus, but after a while, I kind of decided that I wanted to be a professor. I had a great professor early on that was so engaged and engulfed with rhetoric and so passionate about it that I thought, oh, let me pay attention to this. He loves this stuff. And then I started to get really interested in it and thought being a professor would be a great career. This professor also helped me get a fellowship to continue on and get my master's, also from Syracuse. And so I was on path to be a professor, but I wanted a break before going into a PhD program. But I wanted to stay on a campus because I just loved the energy of a college campus, loved the ideas, loved the diversity of people and thought and all the opportunities, many of which are free. So I started, and my thesis advisor's wife had done admissions at Hamilton. She was a professor at the time, but in a previous life, she'd done admissions, and it just sounded interesting and cool, getting to travel around and getting to meet different folks and read the stories. And so I decided that I would move to Boston because I had an uncle who lived in Roxbury, and I had a lot of friends from Syracuse who lived there, and I knew there were a lot of schools. So I finished up my studies, moved home to save money, moved to Boston, and found an ad in the Boston Globe for admission counselor at Wentworth Institute of Technology, which I wasn't familiar with at the time, but went in, had the interview, they hired me, and that was the start of my admission career. So I was at Wentworth for a couple of years, then I moved up Huntington Avenue to Northeastern University and was there for a year, and then I realized, I love admissions. This is great. I don't want to be a professor. I want to do this. But Boston wasn't the right place for me, so I moved home to Philly and then worked at Haverford College for 11 years, and that was where Julia and I met. Had several different positions there, coming in as assistant director, leaving as senior associate director, and then I went to Friends Central for about 5 years as co-director of college counseling, so Friends Central being a Quaker independent school right outside of Philly. And then I went back to admissions at Drexel University in Philadelphia, first as director of admissions and then as dean of admissions, and was there for about 5.5 years. And then that brings me to my current role as VP for enrollment at Ursinus College. And I've been here just over a year and a couple of weeks.
That's awesome. I know I met you definitely when you were at Haverford. I know you came and presented at the college fair that we did a few times. I remember meeting you at Haverford College. And then I remember when you went to Friends Central. What year would that have been?
That was 2012.
Okay.
Summer of 2012. And then I left in spring of 2017.
And our listeners, I know you're only listening to this, but one thing very distinctive about Michael, he's dressed to the hilt here with his tie, his white shirt, his blazer, but he's got the big Jackson 5 fro that I used to have when I was a teenager. So really makes him stand out, and I love it. I'm like, I hope you never cut that off there, Michael.
I'm going to have it until it decides not to be around anymore.
And Julia, what would you like to our listeners to know about Michael that he never shared?
Well, since we only booked Mike for maybe, I don't know, an hour and a half, I'll have to. But I do want our listeners to know this is really special for me and really important. I would say Mike has been the most influential person in my career since day one, and also will totally be unbiased and say he's also my best friend in life as well. And it's really special for all of us to be on, because also, Mark, I feel like you've been such a great mentor to me and have really held me in the same ways and inspired me in the same ways as Mike. So to me, this is like the pinnacle of like, hopefully it is some sort of way of me to honor sort of everything I've gotten out of both of our relationships. And even though Mike and I haven't formally worked together for over 12 years almost, we stay in a lot of contact, and like you said, Mark, just a real thought leader in this work. And I will say, if you know Mike Keaton, like, your life is set in admissions. Like, everywhere I have been and everyone I know is thanks to Mike. He's a very cool person to know.
And I know Mike
You're
to be
too
a very
kind.
good critical thinker, because I remember the questions that you would ask just with the interaction. I remember interacting with you both at Westtown School and at Haverford, and I'm like, you think at a very deep level, and so we'll hope that some of that will come out in our conversation. So we're going to transition. Mike's going to be with us for a couple interesting topics. We're going to start out by talking about FAFSA, changes in FAFSA, how those changes are impacting institutions, things parents and students need to know. Then we'll transition a little bit and talk about fit, the importance of fit versus selectivity. And then we'll close out just talking a little bit about the current school for which he leads, Ursinus College, one of the real small gems in the country. So let's start out with the FAFSA, and, let's dive right in. So FAFSA's undergone its biggest overhaul in decades, arguably ever. Some are calling it FAFSA simplification. Others are saying it's not so simple. What are some of the changes parents and students need to know about the new FAFSA that's different than the old FAFSA? Mike, take it where you want.
Sure. There's a lot of different changes, and I'm certainly not an expert in this, and I definitely rely on my student financial services and financial aid folks and what I read up on a lot of it. But I think some of the most important things for students and families are, it's called simplification, right? They're calling it FAFSA simplification. So one of the things is the amount of time should be cut down quite drastically. It's gone from a maximum of 106 questions to 46 questions as the maximum, and some students won't even have to do a full 46 questions. You can list more colleges. So the old version, you could list 10. Now it's 20. There's additional languages. I think the old one only had Spanish and English. Now it's going to be the 11 most common languages. I'm not sure what the other ones are or what criteria they're using for most common, but certainly expanded access in one's native language is a very good thing. The IRS data retrieval tool will now be mandatory part of it, so that also should expedite things in a lot of cases. And then I think the other most important thing is the methodology for calculating what the government thinks families should be able to contribute is changing. And there's a lot of different pieces to that, but I think some of the most important things for families are that it should be an increase in Pell Grants, which is a federal grant program that never has to be paid back. So they're saying it should be in excess of 600,000 additional Pell Grant awards, and including a lot more maximum Pell Grant awards, which this past year was just over 7,000. And I don't know that we have the new value yet, but presumably would be at least a little bit more than what it was last year.
Mike, how would you say some of these, I know how they're affecting me on my side and families, and as someone Even my our admin assistant, she has a child in college, so even she is working with this. But how have the FAFSA changes affected colleges and universities? And maybe also if you want to speak specifically about Ursinus.
Sure, that's a great question. And the main thing, it's affecting colleges and universities, but also many students. The timeline has been shifted. So I probably should have said that in the last answer, but for the past several years, the FAFSA opens up in October, and this year they were still working on the changes, so it was pushed back to the very end of December. And we still don't have colleges, we meaning colleges and universities, so Ursinus, but everywhere else, we haven't gotten the data from the FAFSA yet. So we have been unable to put together need-based financial aid packages because we need that info from the government. So what that means for us is we've had some students that we've already admitted through early decision and early action, and we've actually released a few regular decision folks early on, and we've been able to go out with our merit institutional aid, but we haven't been able to provide full financial aid packages because we need the FAFSA data to figure out who is getting state and federal grants. And so students and families are getting a picture of what a particular institution is really going to cost them. Many of them are getting that pushed further and further down the line. And then also recently, it's been released that when they were putting together the new methodology, they were relying on inflation data from April of 2020 and not April of 2023, which basically means that for many students would not get as much aid as they should. So now they have to go back and correct for that. And they said that they're going to do it in time for this year, but what is unclear is how much further down the line that timeline is going to be. So it's really challenging for most institutions because price point and aid manipulation is part of what helps you be able to yield a class. And so some folks have said, well, at least we're all in the same boat. And I don't believe that's accurate. I think that much like the recent pandemic that we had, like we're in the same storm, but it's not the same boat. Some people have yachts, some people have little rowboats, some people maybe have a flotation device, so it doesn't affect everybody the same way. Those really wealthy places that are going to meet full demonstrated need and are in a position to do that and have high levels of prestige where people are going to go there even if they can't afford it or even if it's not the best financial choice, they're going to be, I'm not going to say that they're not affected, but they're going to be a lot less affected than the overwhelming majority of schools out there that are tuition driven and depend on enrolling a certain number of students and have to work really hard to get to that number, and for parents and families to it's an investment, and so to have a clear picture of what it is that you're actually investing in, to have that pushed further down the line is going to be a change and a challenge for many students and families, as well as folks in positions like mine.
Let's take a break to learn about Mark's recommended resource for the week.
The recommended resource for episode 401 is the Common App, or better known as the Common App Mobile. And so what the Common App for mobile does is it allows a student to navigate the entire first year application from any device with the mobile app. So you can actually search for colleges, you can request recommendations, you even write your essays, all from your mobile app. And you can keep on track by checking out the deadlines and the app requirements on the dashboard checklist. You can also get helpful information about approaching deadlines and any tasks you have to complete. So check out the Common App for mobile, and we'll put a link in the show notes. Julia, you mentioned it's impacting you on the counseling side. Anything you want to add to what you're seeing? Okay, friends, I'm flying by the seat of my pants a little bit here. This is a first, and we got to go with the flow. So Julia's internet disconnected, and we lost the rest of what she had to say. So I'm going to do my part, do my best to paraphrase what Julia said here. So Julia was talking about the major $1.8 billion snafu that was made by the Department of Education, and how lawmakers told the educational department to use a new, more generous formula in order to protect more of a family's income from factoring into financial aid eligibility. And they told the department to adjust for inflation. However, that actually didn't happen. The adjustment for inflation did not occur. And the bottom line is that makes it look like a family has more money, and then therefore it ends up throwing off their aid eligibility. So let me explain it a little bit more. There's a problem because when you protect more of a student or a family's income, it allows them to qualify for more financial aid. And if you fail to adjust your income protection allowance for inflation, especially during these last few years, because we all know inflation has been so rampant, then it makes it look as though students and families have more income at their disposal than they really do. So salaries go up every year and expenses go up every year with inflation. So you need to make that adjustment. So the bottom line is this did not occur, and it resulted in a $1.8 billion of extra financial need-based aid that especially under-resourced families should be eligible for. And so according to a guy named McKibben, who's an expert in this area, a single parent with 2 children trying to go to college would have more than $10,000 of income that would be considered in the student aid math than they should have. So therefore, making it look like they can pay more and therefore decreasing the amount of financial aid they get. So this massive snafu is causing all kinds of problems. And I'll be back at the very end to say more about this.
I appreciate the fire, Julia, and it would have been great if they just waited until next cycle once they knew that they had everything up and running and in order. And that's part of the, I'm in favor of a lot of what they're trying to do, and in favor of simplifying it. And you have to have something, right? And you have to have a way for folks to apply for aid. So I know we need to have a tool. There's never going to be anything that's perfect. I like the idea of simplifying it and making it easier and streamlining certain pieces, but it would be nice to get it all up and running and know it works before you actually introduce it, instead of disrupting the process for thousands and thousands of parents and students and college administrators.
So, Michael, I have a question. One of the things that's been the most controversial about FAFSA simplification has been how the calculation is done when 2 kids are in college at the same time. Do you want to talk a little bit about sort of how it was done in the past, how it's being done with the new FAFSA, and then are you finding that schools are considering that under professional judgment and reverting back to the old method, or is it kind of it is what it is? What are you seeing out there? Because that's the thing for all of my interactions that causes the most angst, particularly for parents that have multiple kids in college simultaneously. What do you want to say on that?
I'll try to answer in the least technical terms as possible. In the old way, there was a recognition that if you had multiple students in college at the same time, so you got a little break, it made it the threshold for qualifying for aid or how much aid was lowered if you had multiple students in college at the same time. And that's no longer going to be the case with the new methodology. And I think part of it, we're still trying to get an understanding of how it's all going to come together, because that's just one factor, right? It's going to be different for every family based on, well, what are the other factors? What are the income and assets in play? And is there a business involved in the family? What we're doing is when we see that folks are going to potentially look at a decrease in aid because of the new methodology, because of the sibling piece or any other factors, we are utilizing our appeal process to look at each case individually and exercise professional judgment to determine whether or not we'll provide additional aid. So not really circumventing the new process that the government is putting together, but looking at, since we give both institutional need-based aid and institutional merit aid, we're just going to look at each individual case and correct for that on the institutional side.
I think there are quite a few positives, though. I mean, you did mention that earlier. Why don't we talk a little bit about that? Do you want to share, go into a little bit more detail about some of the things that you like about the FAFSA simplification, besides the fact that it's 46 questions instead of 106? I mean, because there really are. I mean, once it gets launched, like, I personally like it better. I'll just be honest. Overall, I think there's a lot of exciting things about it. And what do you want to say?
Well, I'll just kind of mention my favorite things about it are some of the things I already mentioned. So certainly the time piece and the reduction of questions, but being able to list 20 colleges, I don't know that I'd advocate for students applying to 20 colleges, but I think there are many instances where students may need to apply to more than 10, right? So I think now there's reasonable bandwidth there to list all the different schools that they're looking at. I love the addition of other languages besides English and Spanish. I want folks of all different native and first languages to have access to college and being able to pay for college. The connection with the IRS data retrieval tool, while it may have some additional complications for some students, but it should also streamline it and make it a little easier. And of course, the increase in the Pell Grant program is just, when we talk about barriers to higher education, there's many, and many of them have to do with the way our society is set up, and not even just directly with the educational system, but certainly cost, is one of the giant roadblocks. So I like that, we'll have more students that are eligible for Pell Grants overall, and more that will be eligible for the maximum Pell Grant award.
I mean, some people I know are concerned with how family farms and businesses were categorized before and how they were protected and how that has to be reported differently. But some things in the past that used to count in the income bracket are now counting in the asset bracket. And that makes a huge difference when it calculates your student aid index, because the formula is really driven mostly by income. It's mostly income that drives your FAFSA higher, right? So if you have untaxed income, that's going to drive your FAFSA higher. And even 529s and how that's being categorized with money that grandparents had held or in the parent's name. And so I think overall, it feels to me like an attempt to be fair. Overall, it certainly is an attention to the more under-resourced students. For example, you can actually have a student aid index that can go beyond the cost of attendance now, right? That can go to like negative 1,500. And that can come into play sometimes with incidentals and other things. And so I think it's been motivated to make things simpler, but also to attempt to bridge the gap between, haves and have-nots. Now, having said that, I was glad the way you worded things earlier, Michael, when it came to talking about, you said something to the effect of, it tells you the amount that they feel like you should pay, because any of us who are on the counseling side know that people almost have a cardiac arrest when they when they think they're going to qualify for financial aid and they go through and they find out whether you want to call it EFC or SAI is, and they're like, how in the world do they think I could pay $50,000? Like, I don't know how I could pay 20. The formula does take a pretty significant amount of your discretionary money. But one thing I like is that the income protection allowances are higher. So the amount that's actually shielded from going into the calculations at all is a higher amount. And that's one of the reasons why you're going to have more Pell Grant students. And also there's different ways in which they're calculating Pell. And I think going back and linking it to the poverty rate, I think it's simpler and more straightforward. So I don't want to beat up on it too much because overall I like the positives, and like anything new, I'm sure there'll be some wrinkles that'll get ironed out as we get feedback. What are you hearing from other people at other schools, Michael, that you interact with? Sure, you talk with your colleagues at other schools. Like what's the skinny on FAFSA?
It depends who I'm talking about, which other schools that they work for. I think everybody wishes that they just waited until next year and rolled it out in October. That's certainly the main thing that I'm hearing. But then a lot of the same things that I'm expressing, just frustrations about, you do this work and you choose this work because of your passion and excitement for higher education and wanting to provide those opportunities. That I always just approach this work of, I had such a great experience in my undergrad years, and how can I help other folks identify places that would allow them to have the same kind of great experience. And the change in the timeline has been disruptive of that. So not being able to provide those answers, a simple answer, like when in the consumer world, it's like you know how much something costs and you determine whether or not you really want it and whether or not you can afford to pay for it. And it's just challenging to have to deal with a completely different timeline, and not only a different timeline, but through so many points, the uncertainty of like, it's coming down the road, but when, right? And so not even knowing that there's a particular date or a particular time that you're going to have all of the answers. So I think we're all just trying to do the best that we can with the information that we have, and keep the ball rolling until those gaps are filled in.
So Michael, if there's a parent listening and they've had some frustration with FAFSA for the reasons we've mentioned or any other reason, who do you recommend they contact? Do you recommend they reach out to colleges, or do you recommend I'll just leave it open-ended and see where you go with that.
I do. I always think it's a good idea to reach out to a particular college or university that you're working with. And, particularly if you have certain challenges that may be unique. Sometimes parents and families may think they're unique circumstances and they aren't, but sometimes they may be, or even if they're not unique, the college or university might be hearing enough of those same issues and have some type of guidance to provide to help put families back on the right track. And things are changing so rapidly as well. So I said earlier that I am relying a lot on my director of student financial services, and her and her team are keeping on track of all the changes and recent updates. And sometimes it's week to week, sometimes it's day to day. So the colleges and universities, they have their own networks of folks where they get information from, and sometimes are privy to things that may not be easily searchable by looking at newspaper articles or listening to podcasts and those kinds of things.
Awesome. Well, that's been a great sort of overview of FAFSA. Friends, we recorded this 6 days ago, and wow, things have taken a turn for the worse since we recorded. So families and students will have to wait even longer for financial aid offers from colleges and universities. Yesterday, which was Tuesday, January 30th, the U.S. Department of Education made an announcement that there's going to be another delay in what's already been the turbulent FAFSA so-called simplification rollout timeline. So the department says that it won't be able to send students their FAFSA data until the first half of March. Okay, previously they said it would be late January, now the first half of March. So there are more than 17 million students that this can impact. And the FAFSA is key to getting those free government dollars to help pay for college, including work study and the federal student loan program. So this new 4 to 6 week delay is just really going to put schools in a bind, as colleges can't determine what the financial aid award is from the government side of things. So that's an important announcement. we talked about most of the major changes that are happening with the new FAFSA simplification. But in editing, I noticed there are a few we never talked about that I think are pretty important. So I want to share a few of them that I never shared or we never talked about. One is that different parents may need to fill out the FAFSA now. So in the past, the way in which divorced parents had been handled by the FAFSA is very different from the new rules for dependents. Remember, most students are dependent students. So starting with the 2024-2025 form, the parent who provides the most financial support for the student over the last 12 months, that is going to be the parent that's going to be the FAFSA contributor. And if this parent is remarried and they didn't file their taxes jointly, their spouse will also have to be a contributor, meaning like their income and assets will be factored into whether or not the student qualifies for need-based aid. In the past, the FAFSA used the financial information for the parent the student lived with the majority of the time, regardless of whether that parent provided the most financial support. So I once worked with a student, lived with the mom. Mom made 65, the dad made 400, and nobody ever saw that 400. It was invisible because only the mom dollars had to be reported. Now the person who provides the most financial support has to be the contributor. So that's a major change. Another thing is the Pell Grant eligibility is now going to be tied to family size and to the poverty level. And Michael mentioned how the Department of Education estimates that 610,000 additional under-resourced families will now qualify for Pell. He mentioned that. But I also wanted to mention to you that an estimated 1.5 million are now expected to receive the maximum Pell with these changes. And max Pell is $7,395. A third major change, and I mentioned this briefly earlier, that the income protection allowance is going up. This is the amount of money that's basically required just to live, just mere subsistence. So when the income protection allowance goes up, it results in reducing the student aid index by up to 5,000 for dependent students and up to 3,000 for independent students. So it's important to know, like, this is some significant money. And the last thing I want to share is it's very important to remember that there are about 180 wealthy colleges, almost all of them private, that don't use the FAFSA for their own institutional aid. They use the College Board's product known as the CSS profile. And it's important to note that the CSS profile has not announced any significant changes or even minor changes that I'm aware of in their formula for this year. So when it comes to institutional aid from some of the wealthier schools, that's not going to be impacted by these changes, but it's really going to impact the government grants that students get from the federal government, also from state governments as well. And friends, this is literally 6 hours from when this episode goes live. And I want to thank Nemanja because it's midnight his time and he's working on this episode. But this article just broke in response to the FAFSA delay being pushed back to March. And it's entitled "Another Devastating FAFSA Delay." And we can thank our listeners. A listener who goes by the tab Hawaii sent it to us. It's about this pushback and the impact that it's going to have on colleges. And I just want to read a quote from Angel Perez, who's the leader of NACAC. And here's what he says, President. "I am stunned, gobsmacked, really," said Angel Perez, president of the National Association of College Admission Counseling. "This is devastating. I'm not sure what other word to use. For the students, the FAFSA is supposed to help, and for institutions that have been waiting for this information." Goes on to say the delay is just the latest hiccup in the rollout of the new FAFSA. And then here's one more quote I want to read from the article that really is going to have a lot of ramifications, probably especially for seniors in the senior class. Here's what it says. "With this last minute news, our nation's colleges are once again scrambling to determine how to best work with these new timelines." And it goes on to say, "Universities may be forced to push their usual May 1st student commitment deadlines back to June or even July." Perez said that while discussion with NACAC member institutions were ongoing, here's a quote from Perez, the president, I can't imagine maintaining the traditional May 1st deadline under these circumstances. And literally, as soon as this hit, Julia sent a text into our co-host group message to say, Columbia College already announced June 1st deadline instead of May 1st for this year because of the FAFSA.
And now it's time for our College Spotlight of the Week.
Hello, folks. I'm here with the fabulous Sylvia Borgo, and she's going to give us a skinny on a school that I am really excited to learn about, the Wentworth Institute of Technology in Boston, Massachusetts. How's it going, Sylvia?
It's going really well, Lisa. It's great to see you.
Oh, likewise. So tell us about your visit.
Yeah, so I had a fabulous opportunity to visit some Boston universities and colleges in September of this year, so a couple of months ago. And I had a wonderful time in the city. Boston, obviously, to many of your listeners, I'm sure know, is just a fabulous city to visit, and especially if you're in the field that we are, which is obviously college consulting. They have so many schools. But today, I would love to talk a little bit about Wentworth. So I visited 14 schools in a span of, I can't remember if it was 9 or 10 days. And I had such a great time on so many of the campuses. And Wentworth specifically really caught my eye for many different reasons. So let me start off by saying that Wentworth, giving you a little bit of the background. So it's over 100 years old. It was founded in 1904, and it is part of the Colleges of the Fenway. And Colleges of the Fenway is a consortium of colleges, 5 of them, which includes Wentworth, Emmanuel College, Simmons College, Massachusetts College of Art and Design, formerly known as Mass Art, and finally, Massachusetts College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences. And so being a California girl, and one of our famous consortiums here are the 5 Claremont colleges. And so just pretty much imagine a similar structure, but in Boston. And so Wentworth is part of one of these colleges in the consortium, which together, all 5 colleges have 12,000 students together. Wentworth is a little bit smaller. It has, it's an institution that has many programs, about 22 academic programs, but they're really robust and they're really interdisciplinary. And the reason I bring up the consortium is because I think what would be super exciting for some students is that they can go ahead and cross-enroll in the other colleges. You can cross-register. So if there is a class at Emmanuel College that you think would be super interesting to take, you can certainly take it, or Mass College of Art and Design. So it's a fabulous opportunity. One way that you can find out a little bit more about the programs and even have a one-on-one experience with them is they have a program over the summer called Impact Lab, which is hosted on their campus. And you can do that after your 10th grade year or your 11th grade year. And some of the programs that they have at Wentworth that might be worth checking out, maybe not at the Impact Lab, but if you're considering applying, there's a lot of STEM programs, but there's a lot of like art and design and architecture programs. They have 5 schools. They have the School of Architecture and Design. They have the School of Computing and Data Science, super exciting. They have a School of Engineering. They have a School of Management, and they have a School of Sciences and Humanities. So in those 5 schools, they have 22 programs total. The School of Engineering is the one that has, it seems like the greater variety of academic programs. They have biological engineering, computer engineering, civil, electrical, mechanical, and biomedical engineering.
Wow, that's a really big variety of programs.
Yes, and I wanted to, if it's possible, I wanted to talk a little bit about the structure of the school. As I toured around, As you can see, I'm really excited about the programs that are available. Especially, I work with a lot of students who are engineering bound students here in California, but also data science and computing. And every once in a while, I'll have a student that says, I really have this side of my brain that's very mathematical and sciencey, but there's also this other part that I really appreciate developing or want to honor, and that's kind of like my creative side and like this problem thinking side that's more design or creative. And so that possibility to take classes in a environment that is pretty STEMmy. Of course, they have the School of Management and Sciences and Humanities, but very engineering focused, and then also be able to take classes in architecture or industrial design is super, super exciting. Let's see. I know that sometimes parents or students might ask, what kind of student are they looking for? And I think that the kind of student that would really thrive at Wentworth is someone who is likes to work with their hands, maybe likes to put their learning into practice. And the reason I say that is because when I was touring the classrooms, they were set up more like labs. So imagine having not a lecture hall, not where people are just at their seats with a little fold up desk and writing notes, but rather tables where students can sit and collaborate, kind of like those long plastic event tables that you can sometimes see like at events or picnics. And people can move those tables because they only weigh about like 20 pounds or something. You can move them around and collaborate as you see fit. And then in many of the classrooms that I saw, they really have the technology, the computers, the machines. I don't know how else to describe them, but the machines set up around the classroom. So even though I didn't observe a class in taking place, I can certainly imagine that a professor would come in and start talking about the material or that day's instructional goals. And then the students could collaborate at the tables or go to these workstations, these project stations, where they could go ahead and put their learning into place. So it was a really dynamic, really exciting environment.
Yeah, and I think that's so important because there are a lot of kids who really learn best by doing. They're active, they're kinetic learners. They do not enjoy sitting in very large lecture halls for an hour and a half. And I'm guessing that doesn't happen too often at Wentworth.
No, not at all. I was mentioning a little bit about the type of student that would be super interested in this kind of environment, and you hit the nail on the head. Other characteristics that I think might suit a student who might be interested. Wentworth is. I'm a city girl. I grew up in Los Angeles, and so I'm a city girl, and I really appreciate the vibe of city life. What I really enjoyed about Wentworth, it was right in the middle of the city. Well, I wouldn't say middle. I'm not too familiar with Boston geography, but it felt like really an urban campus. However, they have a nice little quiet part of that section of Boston. So it doesn't feel like there are bikers and rollerbladers and dog walkers coming in and out of your campus to, interrupting that vibe. But certainly, as soon as you walk like 5 minutes away from that area where most of the classrooms are, you can hop on the T line. Is it called the T line? I forget.
It's called the T. Yeah.
The T. You can hop on the T and head on over to another part of town. Really, really dynamic, really vibrant part of town, which I really enjoyed. And another type of student that I think might be drawn to that. So just that kind of city vibe. And from what I have observed, the two guides that took us on our campus tour and that were available to chat afterwards were just really, really kind and patient. And I guess the vibe was very much like, oh, sure, we have all the time in the world to show you around, answer your questions. As they were guiding us around, they would, wave hello to their friends, like in the dining hall or across the street, and just really, it felt like such a positive community where people knew each other. I would say about every 10 minutes, somebody stopped by and tapped one of the tour guides on the shoulder and said like, hey, how's it going? Or, like another friend or a buddy, or they would say something like, oh, I'll get you those notes later. Or, just really I felt like people were seen. So a student that might be looking for a community that is a little bit smaller, yet doesn't feel small because, like I said, it's in this very vibrant urban environment, and you can cross-register with the different colleges. This would be a fantastic place. If I may go back to this idea of students who really thrive by doing, Wentworth, one of the most exciting things I think that I learned about Wentworth, especially since the day before I had visited Northeastern, is the co-op program. So obviously, Northeastern, super, super famous for having a co-op program. Well, guess what? Wentworth has one as well. Every Wentworth student must complete 2 co-ops, and they have the opportunity to complete 3 if they so choose, but they must complete 2. And the co-ops are full-time, full semester, and paid. All co-op opportunities are paid. I know that at some co-op schools, sometimes when I ask, the social sciences majors are sometimes have unpaid internships or co-ops, and the STEM majors have sometimes the paid opportunities. But at Wentworth, all the co-ops are paid. And of course, as is the case with, I think probably most co-op programs, while you are taking that semester to work in your field of study, you don't pay tuition. So even though your degree could be a 4-year degree, you really are working 1 year out of that 4 year because of those 2 semester co-ops. And so really your tuition would be, I would think, equivalent to a 3-year program, which is exciting, I think, for some students to understand. I would be super happy if my own children had co-ops that were fully paid and we weren't, we were not on the hook for tuition. The co-ops can be in the city of Boston. Clearly, obviously, that would be there are plenty of opportunities there, but they could also be remote. For example, one of our tour guides said that their friend or their roommate was from California, and they wanted to do a co-op at home. Or back at home in California. And so they worked with their advisor and professors, and they set that up so that the student could have a co-op opportunity in their home state. So I thought that was really fantastic.
Yeah, no, that's so great. And are they competitive, the co-ops, to get? Because I know that's a complaint about Northeastern sometimes.
They are not as competitive as Northeastern, in my opinion, for a couple of reasons. One, just the size of Wentworth. It's just a much smaller environment. And because they are absolutely mandatory, not optional, then there is that support from the co-op office where they have to work with the students to match them in an area of their field, which I thought was really exciting as well.
Yeah, that's great. So that just gives you less anxiety and more opportunities.
Absolutely. A couple of other things. Let's see. There's about 4,000, I guess maybe a couple of little facts, about 4,000 undergrads, a little bit more male heavy than female heavy, about 77%, 75% are male, so 3/4 are male. They do have a robust financial aid package, which another reason that I was very interested or very excited about Wentworth is that a lot of students do indeed get merit aid or qualify for merit aid. As a matter of fact, this is kind of something funny about me. Whenever I meet with admissions directors or admissions offices, college fairs, etc., I always ask, like, one of my number one questions is, can you please tell me about your most generous merit scholarship? And if you can share, who is a typical student who might get that scholarship? So the top scholarship is $25,000 a year. And in order to keep that scholarship, you must have a 2.5 in college, your college GPA. So very, very, that's I think a very reachable GPA opportunity. So 25,000 is the top scholarship. And the best part, in my opinion, is you get to keep that scholarship a 5th year if you wanted to do your master's program there. Yeah. So I thought that was fantastic.
Friends, this concludes the first part of Lisa and Sylvia talking about Wentworth Institute of Technology in Boston. We hope you'll join us next week for the final part. Friends, on Monday's episode, it is officially the start of year 7. And if you know anything about your college-bound kid, we tend to have some announcements on anniversaries, and I have a couple big ones for you. So I hope you'll join us on Monday for the start of year 7. And friends, we'll have a speak pipe question that, to be honest, I haven't selected it yet, but I have a bunch to pick from. I know it will be one I did with Lisa. And then we'll have the final part of Andy Strickler's interview, where he looks at how reading files from a large school group is different from an average or a small school group. And friends, I close you out with something that you'll see at the bottom of every one of my emails if you ever email me. And it's simply this: your attitude, not your aptitude, will determine your altitude. In other words, your attitude, not how smart you are, will determine how high you will soar in your life and in your career. See you Monday, friends. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Linda Depker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joyce Ducker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stelianos Dimitriou. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Linda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcasts. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.